Hello everyone. It's gone very cold, hasn't it? Is it cold at your house? I have just come in from outside and I needed my thick hat and I needed a thick cosy jumper on, and now I'm warming up with a nice hot cup of tea. Now I know it is winter and this is when we are furthest away from the sun. And that's because the world tilts slightly to one side. We're not straight up and down. We tilt slightly. So when the sun is over here and we're tilted away, we're over here, it gets very cold. And this is what the season of winter is all about. It's how far away we are from the sun. But I am interested to learn more about snow and ice, because actually loads of you have been commenting that you've seen lots of ice when you've been out and about. And at the end of last week, we were all enjoying the snow, weren't we? And I believe that the snow is forecast to come again. So let's find out what actually makes snow. Well, on this page it says, what exactly is snow and ice? Well, clouds are made up of tiny droplets of water, really, really small, smaller than we can actually see, but similar to what we see coming out of our kettle. Lots of puffs of smoke, isn't it? It's not really smoke though, it doesn't sting our nose. It's water vapour. It's sort of hot, hot water. We call it steam. When these freeze, they change into tiny crystals. Yes, Theo, crystals. They'll be sparkling. I know you love anything that sparkles. The crystals move around inside the cloud, and sometimes they bump into each other and they make a bigger crystal. So, hello, one little one, hello. And then they bump and they make a bigger crystal, and that might go around, hello, hello, and it might bump into another one and make an even bigger crystal. Which is why sometimes snow can fall in very, very tiny flakes, and other times it forms into these big, enormous flakes that very quickly cover the ground. When they're large enough, they're too heavy to stay up in the sky, so they fall down. And if the temperature is freezing, then they will fall as these beautiful big snowflakes. So that would suggest that sometimes it does make snow up in the clouds, up in the sky. But if it's not cold enough down here, it'll probably fall as rain. Ugh, we don't want rain, do we? Now, as snowflakes fall from a cold cloud, they become softer and they stick together more easily. Soft flakes can be rolled into balls and used to make interesting shapes. Can you see over here? Snow is a good building material. And I believe that this is somewhere across, maybe in Russia or maybe in Mongolia or parts of China. They get lots of snow. And look, these sculptures are made out of snow. Oh, I've attempted a snowman before, but these are pretty impressive, aren't they? We've got a robot there and we've got people, although he looks like he's got bear ears, and a big castle. Absolutely fantastic. Now, sometimes the snow doesn't fall nice soft flakes, does it? It falls in hard balls. We call this hail. Now, the hard balls of ice form inside a storm cloud. They're tossed around inside the cloud and they bump into water droplets. The droplets freeze into balls of ice. So it's a little bit like the big snowflakes forming, but actually this is a little bit more that they bump and then they might fall a little bit and they might melt a little bit more and then they might bump again. So there's a little bit more melting that goes on when hailstones fall. But when the balls are heavy enough, same as the snow, it can't be held in the cloud anymore and it falls down to the ground. And hailstones in some countries have been this big. Now, luckily and thankfully, not very often here in Scotland, but sometimes in places in America, they can be huge and they break car windscreens. They crack them. Really, really dangerous. But most of the ones we see in this country are more like this. You might see them falling on your grass at home or sometimes on your windowsill. That's where I've spotted them. Now, that's snowflakes and it's the hailstones. We've covered both of those. But what about Jack Frost? Sometimes there hasn't been anything falling from the sky, but the frost when we open our curtains in the morning is there, and it is different from snowfall. During the night, when the sun does not shine, the ground cools down, and in winter the temperature may fall below freezing. If the night air contains a lot of moisture, then tiny, invisible, such tiny little drops of water will freeze when they meet something very cold, such as a blade of grass or a window, and white ice crystals form, and we call this frost. When I woke up this morning, I have some Velux windows. Those are the windows that are in a roof, and they're at a special angle like this. When I woke up, the whole of the outside was frozen solid, but it wasn't like what you find ice on a puddle. It was all leafy, and there were beautiful crystals, and it looked like a plant had grown out on my window, made of ice. It was amazing. A little bit like this one here. And you see it looks like it's a plant, but it's all frosted. When water vapour freezes on twigs and spiders' webs, tiny ice crystals can form. Now sometimes we've seen spider webs out in Form 1, and along the tiny webs, sometimes you get crystals and it looks like spiky bits have formed along the web. Now, freezing and thawing, this is when it can get very dangerous. Have you noticed sometimes during the day where the sun has been, the ice will melt, but then when it gets nighttime again, it refreezes. That is winter when we're living in such cold, cold conditions. Sometimes when that happens, you find icicles. And I saw some people had been to the beach at the weekend and they found these terrific icicles. Now icicles form because some of this frozen water up at the top in the drain pipe has melted a little bit and it started running down. But as it started running, it then was realised, oh, it's very cold, and it started to freeze again. Or maybe that was when the sun put its head behind a cloud, and slowly these icicles get longer and longer and longer because the water is melting, running down, and then it's freezing on the tip, and more comes down, running down, and then it freezes when it gets to the bottom. They're pretty beautiful if you can find them. Now, I think we're ready for a snowy story. Are you ready? Are you cosy and warm enough? Do you need to put your hat on? Possibly not. I'm sure your house is very, very warm, but I have to admit, the room in which I'm doing this video, it's a bit chilly. This is one of my favourite books, so make sure you snuggle down. It's by an author called Nick Butterworth, and he's written a series called Percy the Park Keeper. Have you heard of Percy? He's there, right in the very middle. And this story is called One Snowy Night. It's cold in the park in winter, but Percy the Park Keeper doesn't mind. He puts on his warm coat, his big scarf, and he wears 2 pairs of woolly socks inside his Wellington boots. Percy loves to be out in the fresh air. So do we, don't we? It's lovely. In the middle of the park there's a little hut, and this is where Percy lives. When it's too cold to be outside, Percy goes into his hut and makes a nice, cosy cup of tea. The animals in the park all know Percy and they love to go and visit him. Every day he shares his lunch with them. One winter's night, when it was so cold it began to snow, great big snowflakes fell past the window of Percy's hut. "Brrr," said Percy, "I think I'll need an extra blanket tonight." He made himself some hot cocoa and got ready for bed. Suddenly, Percy heard a tapping sound. There was somebody at the door. Who can that be at this time of night, thought Percy. So he went to the door and he looked out. There on the doorstep was a little squirrel. Oh, he looked very cold and very miserable. I can't get to sleep, Percy. My bed is full of snow. Oh dear, said Percy. you'd better come in. I've got plenty of room for two. And so the squirrel snuggled down in Percy's bed and soon began to feel warm. But there soon was another knock on the door. Who can that be? Thought Percy. Standing outside were two shivering rabbits. It's freezing, said one rabbit. We're frozen, said the other. Oh, you poor thing, said Percy. Come on in and warm up. The rabbit squeezed into the bed next to Percy and the squirrel. There wasn't much room. Could you face the other way, said Percy to the squirrel. Your tail is tickling my nose. Knock, knock, knock. Oh dear, said Percy. There's somebody else at the door. It was a fox, and he looked cold and hungry. Can I come in too? He asked. Percy scratched his head and thought for a minute, looking around. Well, if you promise to behave, he said. I promise, said the fox, and he squeezed into the bed next to all the other animals. But then, bump, whoops, the squirrel fell out onto the floor. Who did that? Said the squirrel crossly. Then came another knock, knock, knock at the door. Good gracious, said Percy. It's the door again. This time Percy had quite a surprise, because there on the step there was a badger, 2 ducks, a hedgehog, and a whole family of mice, and they all wanted a bed for the night. Poor old Percy! And poor old Percy's bed! The animals pushed and shoved and rolled around on the bed, but there was just not enough room for them all. Soon the bed covers ended up in a big, tight ball. Then, bump! The covers rolled right off the bed and everybody fell onto the floor. Oh dear, said Percy, this won't do at all. My bed is just too small. Suddenly, one of the mice pricked up his ears. What's that noise? He squeaked. Everybody listened hard. There it was. They could hear it. It was a scratch, scratch, scraping sound, and it seemed to be coming from right below them. There's something moving under the floor, whispered Percy. The animals all looked a little bit frightened. The mice all started to squeak at once. Oh dear, what could it be? It might be a monster with fierce claws and sharp teeth. The noise grew louder and louder, and then one of the floorboards began to move. Look out! It's coming up through the floor. And suddenly the animals heard a loud creak. Help! Cried the animals, and they all tried to find somewhere to hide. But Percy wasn't frightened. He knew who it was, and he started to chuckle. And then he laughed out loud. A small dark head was sticking up through the floorboards. It isn't a monster, said Percy. It's a mole. I'm sorry to burst in like this, said the mole. I knocked at the door, but nobody could hear me. Percy helped the mole up through the hole in the floor, sat him on a hot water bottle to get warm, and put the floorboard back. It's all right, everyone, he called. You can come out now. But nobody moved. Nobody stirred. Nobody wanted to come out. The squirrel was tucked away in a dressing gown pocket. The hedgehog was in his coat. The fox, the rabbits, the badger and the ducks were all safely hidden away. The mice had even squeezed themselves into Percy's slippers. Everyone had found a cosy bed for the night. Well, I never, said Percy. Percy yawned. That's better. I've now got plenty of room, he said, and a little bit to spare. Shh. Good night, Percy. Good night, Mole. Good night to all the other animals. Sleep well.